Welcome everyone to today's webinar. Today's webinar is about refactoring the cost of quality in 2020. Now, my name is Ronald Cummings-John. I'm going to be your host for today. So it's my job to make sure that you get the most out of this time with us. Now, we are super grateful that you're taking this 50 minutes or so to listen to some of the stuff that we're going to be talking about. So it's my job to make sure that we get the most out of our guest speaker, who I'll introduce you to shortly. Now, in my day-to-day, I'm the co-founder of a company called Global App Testing, and we spend a lot of our time helping companies solve their testing challenges, whether they're big or small companies. And on top of that, just about a year or two ago, we launched this book called Leading Quality. And up until then, all of the books that we were reading and looking at were all about the idea of how do you do testing. And we thought to ourselves there was a gap to really start to look at how do you look at quality when you're in more of a leadership position. So we went all around the world and met some of the top heads of testing, VPs, CTOs of some of the coolest companies, and tried to understand how do they look and think about quality inside their companies. And about just as we hit August, the book actually became an Amazon bestseller. So I can just tell you, if you want to have a book that talks about how do you lead quality in your company, this is the one. Now, one of the great opportunities that comes when you become an author of a book is you get to meet lots of interesting people. And as I had lots of discussions post writing the book with my co-founder, Wace, this idea began to emerge about how do we as leaders look at quality. And we came up with this framework called the impact triangle. And the impact triangle is really looking at the idea that us as leaders in our day-to-day roles, we have to be as cognizant as possible about how the work that we do affects and impacts different parts of our organization. And there are three areas of impact that we have to pay the most attention to. The first is this concept of customer impact. How can we make sure that we're developing an incredible product that our customers absolutely love? How do we make sure that we are dealing with and finding all of the bugs and the issues within our software? The second area of impact that we look at is the idea of team impact. How do we start to make sure that we've got the right resources in our team? How do we make sure that we have the right talent, that we're motivating them and getting the most out of the people that are inside our teams? And then lastly, we start to look at company impact. And company impact is a little bit more broader. It's looking at how do you support the company in its progression to being quality and having a quality product as a whole and as a whole company. And inside that subject there of company impact is where we're going to actually look today, because we're going to be looking at the idea of the cost of quality. So if you take all of those three areas of impact, that's pretty much our roles as leaders in quality. And as I said, today, we're going to be looking at this idea of company impact. Now, when I first went off and was doing some of the research with Wace for the book, we ended up meeting Neil Brown. Now, Neil Brown is the partner at Deloitte for the testing and quality practices. And he spends his days talking to CTOs, VPs, tech leaders, and he helps advise them on how they should be looking at quality inside their company. And he does it for some of the UK's biggest financial services firms. Now, a quick pre-warning here. I've known Neil for a couple of years, and if there's one thing I know about him, is that he doesn't hold back. And so what that means for you is you probably are going to need to get a pen and a paper, get your fastest typing speed on, get your Siri notes, your Amazon Alexa notes, any way you can capture some of the information that Neil's going to be sharing, because when he begins, he's going to go all out, right? So I can't do him a big enough introduction. So I'm going to give it over to you, Neil, to give the audience just 30 seconds explanation about what you're, like a little bit about your role and what you're up to right now.
Let me check and start off by just checking everybody can hear me, because I've had a few issues with that. You're on? A big thumbs up from Ron, so we'll go. My background, I've always worked in consulting. I think as the majority of testing and quality assurance people, I accidentally got involved in that. I was a BA, and through that became quite passionate about wanting to make sure or give confidence as to what I was working with clients on producing and kind of delivering worked and did what it was meant to do, and got more involved in the test execution side then as testing kind of became a thing. I mean, 18, 19 years ago when I first started doing it, testing was probably the newest discipline at the time, and people are still trying to work out what it really meant. So I've kind of watched the voyage as it's moved through from a side of desk overhead that people did if they weren't talented enough to be developers, I've been told previously, which is a lovely statement, and watched it mature through into a big discipline where you'd have multiple heads of test in multiple jurisdictions, all with huge numbers of people, as we now move more into a space where quality is becoming something that everybody's interested in, and those quality engineering functions are driving quality approaches and efficient ways of understanding risk of change in the ever-changing and more complex space that IT now kind of inhabit. I spend most of my time at the moment working with clients looking at how they can get the most efficient risk mitigation techniques into what they're doing, and confidence in change as the complexity of that change increases, but also the scrutiny both from regulators and from us, the public end user, increase.
Nice. And I think I know we're going to be talking on some of those subjects as we kind of expand further in our chat today. And I can just see that Di, you said that you can't hear Neil, but you can see his mouth moving. Just so you know, Di, we are recording this as well, so we should have a recording. If you still can't hear and we're having sound problems, we'll be able to send you over a recording. I have heard from a few other people that they can hear, so I'm going to continue and we'll ask the tech team just to see if they can do anything in the background. If you also cannot hear Neil, please let us know inside the chat box and we can work out if there's anything else we need to tweak. So
not an issue I normally have on that, must admit.
Apparently, if you can't hear using Chrome, apparently now I'm not saying it's a Microsoft situation, but some people have said that if you're using Edge, you're going to need to switch to Chrome. So there you go. I'm biased in my thoughts between Chrome and Edge, so we won't go there. So today's webinar, here is going to be the agenda. The first thing we're going to be going over is what is the true cost of quality. Then we're going to be looking deeper into how do you identify waste to keep that cost of quality as low as possible. And then we're going to look at this balance between, hey, what is the difference between the cost of quality versus the cost of failure? And then finally, we're going to look at some of the top misconceptions that people have around testing and some of the ones that they should be having, or the ideas they should be focused on around testing. And for those that are interested, we have some giveaways and some special stuff for those that want to see how they can work with us further as we go forward. And then after that, we got a nice Q&A time for us to talk. So let me just get this started, right? So, we've spoken a couple of times, and I remember the first set of times that I met you, you would always mention the cost of quality. And you would say, people don't truly understand this piece around cost of quality. And I remember sitting there thinking in my own head, I don't really know what you mean by cost of quality, right? Because you would always say it with just that one line. And so the other day, I asked you to sit down. I was like, Neil, please explain to me your thoughts around the cost of quality. And as soon as you did, I was like, whoa, we need to do a webinar because people need to hear some of these ideas. So Neil, I would love if you could share two things real quickly. Firstly, what do you mean by the cost of quality? And essentially, why is it so important?
Yeah. So the first one is relatively simple, which is what's the actual cost that is accrued when you're looking at delivering a quality product into a production environment? And it's a relatively simple statement, but it's actually quite complex to kind of get underneath. And it's complex for a number of reasons. One, what does quality mean? And quality will mean different things to different people in different industries and different changes. quality for a product that is injecting cancer treating medicine into cells is a completely different level to quality on a payments platform, for example. It's different levels. They're all important, but in different ways. The cost of quality then becomes a different conversation again, and this is where people, in my experience, struggle to pick up all of the different elements and the complexities of that. I will commonly hear that, well, the cost of quality is basically how much your testing team is costing you. And that's part of the jigsaw. But if you actually look at the elements that make it up, you've not just got that resource cost, you've also got the cost of the environments that the test team are utilising. You've got the costs of deployment software, costs of reworking defects and reworking issues that have been identified, costs of the test management and automation tools, costs of failure when you go into production, potential costs of impacts of delayed programs or having to rework production releases. All of those aspects add up, and the ability to measure and track what the cost of quality and the cost of releasing something that was of an acceptable level of risk and functionality into a production environment becomes quite complex. To understand those aspects and how they all add together to provide you with the actual cost of injecting quality and maintaining quality into an end release.
And if I just relay that back to you, it's kind of interesting because when people, I guess, initially look at the idea of cost of quality, what we're saying is they might just go, hey, it's just the cost of my testers or the QA people I have inside my org. But when you really start to look at the true cost or the real cost, that's what you're actually most concerned about, because you're sitting there saying, well, if you start to add up the environments, the deployment infrastructures, the defects, having to refix defects if you weren't doing the testing initially, all of that creates actually a more swelled number that is really impacting the cost of driving your company. And that is actually just a very different perspective than I hear from most people when they even just look at cost of quality. Because you're right, people often look at it from just what is the number of that headcount, and that's it.
Yeah. And what's interesting is if you look at whose responsibility quality is, you will typically get the standard response back of, everybody's responsibility is quality. But when then you look at the cost and where the delays in testing and confidence and quality come, it always comes back to the testing function, when that's only part of that end-to-end jigsaw, and it can't just be looked at in isolation.
And then we had a quick question here from Arena. It said, could you please try to define the definition of quality? Is this being set by the client or by the dev, or is it some kind of standards? Just wanted to get your quick thoughts on that.
So there is a standard out there. As with most things, there'll be an industry definition. To me, one of the most important things to understand when you're looking at the approach to understanding quality or mitigating risk on production change is to understand what quality means to that particular client or that particular industry, and then measure against that. Because as I said at the start, quality will be different to every group that you're working for. And if you try and take that quality measure too far and mitigate the risk and try and enforce additional levels of testing and confidence into a product, actually you end up taking the quality level too far. And at that point, it becomes non-cost effective to do. And it's a really interesting statement that you can actually spend time trying to make a product overly quality, if that's a word, and you've got to find that right measure and that right articulation.
And so when we look at this idea of, you mentioned different aspects of that cost of quality, what are different ways that people can look to, like, either lower that cost or reduce some of the waste that happens? What are your, like, when you go into a company, what do you see as the biggest areas of waste? What are the kind of things that you see people doing? Just want to kind of make it as tangible as possible for the people listening.
So I'd answer that first by saying, do people really understand the aspects that make them up and where they break down? And I don't think they do. So if I broke it up into, it's almost, the way I look at it is there's aspects of it that belong within a old school testing function. There's aspects that belong in what we'd class as the supporting functions, and then there's the cost of failure, cost of impact upon bad release of code that then plays back. Within the testing function, in a kind of old school methodology itself, you've got some of the obvious things around automation and testing tools, and the misconception that, for example, injecting lots of automation will suddenly reduce cost and improve efficiency and throughput. And it absolutely won't. Bad automation is more damaging than good automation can provide value. You have to have the right understanding of what you're testing and how to articulate that. You've got, in most cases, we'll find that scoping of test execution is not as efficient and effective as it should be. If I go and ask a testing function to explain what they're testing, they'll always tell me they're doing risk-based testing. That's the first words they'll say. And then they'll tell me what they're testing. What they won't tell me is what they're not testing and why they're not testing it. And that's really interesting, because actually that's the bit that's of the most important. What you're not testing is where the risk lies, and that's the residual that we need to be able to articulate. That's what the business and stakeholders need to understand, because that's the bit they need to get comfortable with. If you look at the supporting
I was just going to say, we're going to come back to some of that idea of what not to test. And yeah, I wanted to dig into the supporting function side.
So from the supporting functions, there's all of the capability that needs to be in place for us to be effective as a quality engineering and testing function. That ranges from provision of environments, be they on-prem, AWS, cloud type environments, all the way through to bespoke build type COTS products. Whatever that environment and system under test looks like, we need that to be provided to us in a efficient, robust and repeatable way. The worst is where you've got an environment that is stood up, you run your testing on, and then it can't be recreated. Well, that's no value at all. That's a complete waste of effort that we've provided, because we haven't got confidence in the repeatability of that build. Mm-hmm. And then if you look at the other extreme onto the cost of failure, that breaks down into another number of aspects. There's the rework and the redeployment costs and the lost time where you're having to repair, replace, fix code back into that production environment. But you've also got the impact on your end user customer base, the loss of customers, loss of transaction. That all provides an additional cost as well. And across all three of those kind of core aspects, there is significant opportunity to refine and actually focus in on what's important, and focus on spending time, money and energy on actually delivering the main aspects of quality that you want to see into that environment.
And so I want to just quickly ask the audience their thoughts around some of this. So we actually have a live poll. So thinking about inside your company right now, where do you see the biggest opportunity to find waste in your quality process? And Mel, if you could get a poll for everyone to see, you have a few questions there. If you could just tick the ones that you're thinking, we can see, across our audience, where are they finding or seeing the biggest opportunity to find waste right now? I can see the polls coming in pretty fast. Current front runner is looking like downtime and non-QA teams having to test being a huge cost inside the company. The results are still coming in.
And it's interesting. I was saying to Mel before this kicked off, I get quite emotive over the statement of non-QA teams having to test, because why shouldn't they? Quality, as we've kind of said, is everybody's kind of drive. And one of the points that I make at the moment is, if you believe ISTQB standards, then, well, testing independence is vital, and you need to have separation between dev and test. I actually think that's a bit old school, and the ability to merge and multidiscipline teams and have test automation driven in as part of the dev cycle is what we now do, and it's kind of a more modern technique, and the independence actually gets pushed out into the ability to report and understand what the quality measures look like, rather than the people doing the work. Mm-hmm. So I think that there's something else underneath non-QA teams having to test. I think there's a different point in there around skill set of resource.
And interesting enough, now that we've come to the end of the poll, the results completely changed, which was not what I expected. So the results ended up being in the front runner, actually wrong use of automation and or manual testing. Examples, you automate absolutely everything. And that's almost a point that you were raising earlier, which is the viewpoints on that manual versus automation debate can add so much wasted time and effort where people are doing things that they assume are moving them forward, but it's not. So that was the top one. The second top one was downtime, interestingly enough, where people are assuming that just the amount of downtime that exists inside their systems, and that could be actually a systems or just the downtime for people, is a huge level of wastage. So when you look into an organization and you see, if we just take these top three, wrong use of automation or downtime or unstable systems, what do you say to that all? What kind of things are you recommending to them when that ends up being one of the biggest problems? And I think let's look at downtime, because that's something that I haven't heard much people talk about.
Can I ask a different question? If I spin those all together, that becomes one of the most common scenarios we see, especially as we move towards more of a DevOps landscape, is that we will have testing functions that are identified as being inefficient, and defect leakage going through into later test stages or into production that are on unacceptable levels. And the stock answer that will come back is we need to inject more levels of automation. We need to automate more. That will allow higher efficiency and the quality of our testing will be improved. When you dig underneath the covers of that, what you actually find is that through the speed and approach that companies have used to implement DevOps, the release mechanisms and the path to live of how they promote code and control the configuration of it have become are not fit for the way that they are now being used. So they don't have confidence in what's being released. What that creates is unstable systems as you're flowing through that path to live, lack of confidence as to what you've put into production, systems that once they've been initially built and you run your first smoke tests on, come back and aren't working, and other issues such as memory leaks or automation routines running on boxes that are taking up too much memory and bringing them down, and then manifest themselves as downtime, unstable systems and poor release mechanisms. So those three aspects end up being the reason why testing is then seen to be inefficient.
And when you have that conversation, what kind of feedback do you get from people? Are they like, oh, eureka, yeah, it makes sense now, I should change everything? Or do you still get a level of pushback? What is the actual, narrative conversations that happen when you ask those questions?
No, the immediate gut reaction is you're wrong, right? The immediate reaction is automation is the answer to everything. Just automate everything and my world will be snazzy, brilliant and lovely. And it's quite helpful that testers and QA people by definition are fact-based and like reports. Because what we then do is start layering a good level of reporting. And at the end of the day, good testing is the ability to report on the risk being taken and provide those facts. And the more automated reporting methods and confidence we can provide in those metrics, the better. But as you start implementing that, you can start then showing that actually automation isn't just the answer. And automation is part of the solution, but it isn't the entirety of it. And you start digging into the defect processes. You start digging into the release mechanisms. You start looking at the statement of, well, why didn't you find that in test? And you can recreate the test environment relatively quickly because it's AWS spin up and you've got Terraform and other tools that allow you to spin those environments back up relatively quickly. And you find that what you've got in production doesn't behave the same as you had in test. And actually, the code base that you were testing before it went into production is different again. And you can start tracking the environment downtime and seeing how robust an environment is and tracking the memory. And suddenly you've got a basis to be able to start targeting and focusing on where the inefficiencies on the process are. And you can take people on that journey. What I found, however, is if you stick to automation isn't the answer, we need to fix this first, you will lose people quite quickly. You need to take them on that journey and get them to understand that actually just fixing one element, just fixing environments or just fixing automation or just fixing process or scoping or reporting won't solve your problem. You need to really understand how that problem manifests and then start targeting different bits. Some of them will be relatively simple to go after, some of them far more complex. The most complex area we're focusing on at the moment, going back to the skill set and where the non-QA doing QA kind of fits in, is getting and helping the hardcore developer resource to understand that building automation and test automation into their routines and having that QA mindset as you're going through that initial build and using the intelligent stubbing routines and other tooling that we now have to hand absolutely is, one, interesting, two, quite cool, and three, provides a longer term value than just an initial test automation framework.
And I think, that for me also kind of just characterizes the fact that having a more holistic narrative and almost that extra bit of education is so important when we're trying to create the change inside our company. You said at the intro, a lot of your work is actually about helping companies with the change that they're doing inside their companies. And I think that's just a classic case of how important getting that narrative right. And, when you get to work with people like yourselves or us who have just seen it so much more, it's almost like it's just pattern recognition when you walk into some of those companies, right? So
yep.
I'm gonna move us on to another point that in our convos has come up, and you just spoke about it briefly, and it's really just this cost of quality versus the cost of failure. And I'd love to understand from you. There's an interview question that I know you ask around this that gets people thinking, and I'd love if you could just quickly share that question that you use at interviews when you're talking to and hiring new people.
You're stealing my golden. Yeah, okay, fine. So the question I tend to ask basically is, if you had two defects presented to you and you had time to fix one of them. One is a defect in a payments processing engine that does bulk payments. One is a spelling mistake. Which would you fix? Do you want me to stop and see what people say, or do you want me to answer the question?
Do you know what? That is a great question. In the chat, which one would you fix? You can repeat that question again, and let's get some ideas inside the chat. Let's see what people say.
If you work for me, don't answer it. But is it the spelling mistake or an issue with the payments engine?
Which one is more important? In the chat right now, put your thoughts. Is it the spelling mistake, or is it the payment system? We shall see. Bethany asks, where's the spelling mistake? Which has more cost of failure? Depends where the spelling mistake is. Is this a real question?
Yes, it is. So I mean, people have kind of jumped to the point, which is it's all about context and what the failure means. And this is a real life example, and this actually happened. I won't tell you which client, but the payments issue was with a payments engine that processed yearly rebates and wasn't due to go to run again for another 9 months. Whereas the spelling mistake, as somebody's just guessed, was actually in the name of the company on the top of a letter, and they'd been sent to print. So it cost the company, and this is about 10, 15 years ago now, best part of £10 million to reproduce that letter because of postage costs, print costs, and all the rest of the time impacts that went with it. And it's that context of failure and what the ripple effect is that people don't necessarily kind of think through and contextualize. The example that I like to use, coming from a banking kind of place, is a few years back we moved and implemented switching, which allowed people to jump from one bank current account to another current account really quite quickly. So you could do it in less than a day, whereas previously it would take weeks. And the client I was working for at the time was doing a large migration activity to move off of another bank's estate onto their own, and they were very much focused on the transition date, and they had to hit this date because if they stayed on the current platform past that date, they incurred another year's worth of hosting fees. So they focused on speed of transformation and speed of getting off, and deprioritized customer impact right the way down. This was on the BBC website. I won't tell you the names, but you can work it out. Impact on day one was they'd completely reset everybody's password. None of the customer base could log on. The client hadn't taken account of the switching process properly. They lost 25% of their customer base overnight. The next release we did with them, customer journey was number one priority. That's where we focused all of the testing. And if we weren't ready in time, we weren't ready in time. So it's that context that's driven both by the change you're actually undertaking, but also the industry and the aspects that client is working in, and the regulatory customer domain that you're sat within, and the appetite that you've got for failure versus what you're trying to achieve. That context is vital, and people don't spend enough time understanding that context.
Yep, definitely. And so we had a few people that kind of got it, a few people that didn't. Always interesting to see the answers that we get there. Another thing that I often hear you talk about are your views on some of the testing misconceptions that sit out there. So I wanted to just give you a little bit of a space to explain what are some of the areas or buzzwords that you think people have just got a little bit wrong and are focusing far too much on. And then I'm going to ask you a different question after that, which is which areas do you think people should be focused on?
Okay. We've kind of touched on my biggest bugbear, which is automation. Automation is vital. We absolutely need to consider how we inject automation as early as possible into the process. And we need to make sure that's done in the right way. But it's always going to at least initially increase cost. And done poorly, it's going to make the matter worse. We've also touched on my ISTQB issue. I think the majority of testers have had a giggle at various times over a successful test case being one that finds a defect. You can say you agree with that or not. It's kind of up to opinion. The one that I think really doesn't hold water anymore is that testing independence one. I think if we maintain a premise where testers are completely siloed, independent, completely different mindset to the dev resource, we're going to struggle with the move toward DevOps. And we're missing a whole ability to make a far more efficient and different process. It's why we've moved from within Deloitte talking about our testing function and moving towards more of a quality engineering function. There will always be a space for manual testing. There'll always be a space for the way that testers kind of think and articulate things. But we need to move more into that tech space, and we need to multidisciplinary teams. That's where you find some real value and efficiencies and different ways of thinking. One of the most successful things we've done recently is start bringing in full stack developers and getting them to think about testing rather than being a Java developer, and how they can use that same skill set to drive that automation framework. We have some really interesting conversations now around, is there a place for automation in UAT? Now, I'm a UAT person. That's where I spent most of my life, and I get quite protective over the in user acceptance testing and the user being involved. But if we can find a way to automate some of the more mundane tasks that take the time, and give the users the ability to really focus on the most important things, even within a DevOps landscape, that there's a whole load of really important stuff that they can do there. I think that the biggest thing we need to focus on is, tied back to that independence point, is as we move forward, the role of the QA testing function is becoming more and more around being able to provide that view of quality and what the residual risk on an implementation and change looks like. And being able to do that based on fact, whether that's pulling data from early in the stream in Firestone Cube and some of those other path analysis and kind of black box techniques, all the way through into the more dynamic functional test, automation, functional testing, user acceptance testing, to be able to articulate what's working, what's not, where the risk lies and where you haven't tested, and then being able to identify some of those areas of residual risk where you haven't been able to give confidence over working functionality. So you can then make informed decisions of whether you then test a fallback position. Do we test what a standing process looks like? Do we prove some of those scenarios because actually they're more suitable and more efficient to prove than trying to prove the functionality itself? The other piece that we talk about at the moment is, again, I'll speak to clients who think shift left is a new thing, and we should be pushing quality to the left. I actually think that we've moved away from that. Shift left is great, but we also now need to look at shift right as well. And actually some of the most efficient and effective ways of driving quality and understanding residual risk is actually to do some of the testing in production or on the way into production. And as long as it's done in the right way, things that would have absolutely given me a really bad taste in the mouth. I was going to say something completely different than a really bad taste about testing in production and post-release acceptance tests and other acronyms that testers would put around that thing actually are a key element of our overall strategy. And we need to work out the right way of deploying those things in an efficient and effective kind of joined up approach.
Yeah, and we're seeing that as well at Global App Testing. So the kind of things that we've been noticing over the past half year to a year has been things like people beginning to be more flexible in where they test. So we now, for many of our customers, are testing in production. But not only are we just testing in production after release, they're asking us to do a sort of always on continuous test. So always have someone testing their application in production to see what's happening in different parts of the world, and just trying to get another viewpoint of what risks are happening in different parts of the globe for their applications. The other things that we've been noticing and we've worked on internally is, even though we have this, this crowd of 40,000 testers around the world that we work with companies with, can we make that more API driven, more DevOps user friendly, right? So now you can trigger to use all of our platform via APIs, and that completely shifts the use cases that someone can do when they're working on stuff. And so we're seeing very similar things in terms of from our side as you are from yours. And I'm seeing many comments coming around that.
It's an interesting time to be involved in quality engineering and test for many reasons. I think one of the things that makes a lot of some of the older school test professionals giggle will be the concept of RPA and how that's new. Anyone that was around using WinRunner will just look at RPA and say, well, that's exactly the same, right? We're just automating process. We were doing it for testing. You were doing it to do a business function. Yeah. But where it becomes interesting is where can you combine RPA with AI and machine learning to start predicting what testing should be covered, and how you can use that insight to start really driving testing based on behavior and using the AI to understand the scope and where you should be testing. How can you combine those things? I know we've had numbers of conversation about self-healing automation and the ability to get to 100% self-healing and what that looks like. I'm skeptical we should ever get to that place. But the ability to understand based on metrics and scoping and defect densities and other aspects, and use metrics to drive those AI routines and machine learning to automate and self-heal and self-develop on certain aspects. It's really something quite interesting. How can we leverage that to do something different?
Yeah, definitely. And so I just want to quickly do a quick recap on some of the stuff that we've discussed today. So firstly, we began by talking about the cost of quality. Why does it matter now more than ever before? And I think just as we are continually trying to deliver these products into the market, we have to make sure that our product works. But we have to make sure that we know and understand the full cost of quality, not just this is the headcount cost for the people inside my company. And the more that you understand that full cost of quality, you can actually start to make optimizations in different parts of your organization that's going to improve the overall quality for your customers. The second idea that we talked about was this whole concept of, can you identify where that waste is spent? And many people said that looking at areas like downtime, looking at the use of automation, etc., are key areas to look at when looking at the idea of cost of quality. Then we had a quick chat around, hey, don't forget the cost of failure as well. What are you not testing? And going into a company and not just saying, here's what we're looking at and here's what we're testing, but here's what we've decided not to test, therefore truly understanding what the risk is that is being left on the table. Because sometimes it is okay to have risk, but you want to be aware of the risk so you can make more informed decisions about them. And then just now we were talking about, hey, there are old ways of looking at stuff. There are old paradigms, whether it's the old testing frameworks that were created, or we're talking about the concept of RPA, is that actually new, etc. And sometimes a lot of these ways of looking at stuff aren't actually new and they're not actually different. And we are almost repeating the cycle of some of the old tools that we used to have. And so I wanted to just bring us back to where this whole conversation has started at the start of this webinar. And at the start, I was talking about this concept called the impact triangle. And in this webinar, we were focusing on how we as leaders have to understand the impact to our companies. And when you look at the cost of quality and the total cost of that our companies are spending on improving quality, that's very much a high-level company impact. And it's on us to change that narrative of how the company looks at that as leaders. And so one thing that I wanted to do was share some of the ways and ideas that we look at, because even though you have this impact situation, an additional question often comes up. And that is, how can you still deliver the software that delights your users while keeping that cost of quality as low as possible? And there are two ways that we have done this, and I just want to quickly just give people a view of that so they have some new ideas. So firstly, we at Global App Testing, we have a solution that very much allows companies to leverage a crowd of 40,000 global testers that gives you this 24/7 ability to have a testing resource available, which is specifically useful when you are having to scale up and down your testing resources, or you need extra people, or you don't have the right infrastructure, whether that's devices and operating systems. But we can also do all of that intertwined into your systems, utilizing various APIs to utilize the crowd, and in some cases, delivering results back to our customers within 30 minutes. So that's one way that we might be able to work with people. And we support some of the biggest tech companies in the world, but we also work with a lot smaller ones. So there's a huge range of customers that we have solutions for around this. But the second solution is this concept of using global app testing as well as some of the Deloitte solutions. Now, what that ends up looking like is everything that global app testing already do with the crowd. But on top of that, you get this beautiful strategic advice around, evaluating and reducing that cost of quality inside your company. Neil and the team at Deloitte, I know, have just seen this so many times that oftentimes they just go into a company and they're already able to spot ways of reducing the total cost of quality inside a company. They also have a great way of looking at doing risk analysis and testing strategies alongside some of the stuff that we've been looking at. And I know that they care about this narrative that is inside a company as much as we do. So that is a second solution that you might be able to use if you wanted to find out more how we could work with you. Now, we were trying to also look at what would be interesting for people on this call. And we said, hey, let's also do a little giveaway. So we put together a little giveaway package. So if you end up booking a meeting with us in the next 48 hours, we will be sending you a free digital copy of the Leading Quality book, which is the Amazon bestseller. That is the best book on quality and leading quality in the world. I didn't say that. I read that on an article somewhere that made me smile. There's also some worksheets that really help you look at how do you create a quality narrative? How do you create metrics that your quality team can align to that are pushing and driving the business? And then also we have a master plan template, which is about how do you show QA's value to the C-suite. So this is a whole guide on how do you have some of those conversations with the C-suite to either get budget, adjust budget, make the changes that you think are important. So if you want to have a chat with one of our team, simply go to this link that is here. And I think, Mel, if you could just share a quick a button that people could click in, and that will just take you to a quick page. If you put your email address in there in the next 48 hours, one of our team will get back to you and book a quick chat. We can have a chat about if you're interested in just using global app testing or using this combination of global app testing and Deloitte, and we can go from there. So a quick question that sometimes people ask me when I've spoken about this is, is this right for me? Is this right for my team? Is this what my company should be doing? And we always say that it's good to have a chat if you're in one of these four situations. If you are having a more increased release frequency right now, and there's just a lot that has to be done, perfect opportunity to have a chat with us to see if we can help you with that scale. If you have a lack of resources where you have headcount freezes or you have a lack of operating system and devices that you need to cover, we can support with that. Or if you're unsure about how the whole thing could work, let's just have a chat. And then if you're using someone else and you're like, hey, is this better than my current solution? We may as well have a chat about that. So we're always open to having a chat. And if you go to that link there, we can talk about that further. So what I want to do is open up for 5-10 minutes of questions to you, Neil. And if anyone has any questions over the offer that we just put up, you can post those in here as well. I was following the chat thread, and feel free to put any questions in there into the chat thread now, but I was following the chat thread earlier, and one question that I saw someone ask was, what are your thoughts on technology taking over quality and quality management? And so I think this is alluding to some of those pieces around the AI and the other things where technology is making quality better without the need for humans.
I think it provides lots of interesting opportunities, and we're doing quite a lot of work looking at how we can use AI, machine learning, and different technology to drive approaches, efficiencies. Will we get to a place where the Terminator comes out and takes over the world and everything else? Well, maybe. Let's hope not. But until we get to that place, I think there's always going to be a place for those that can structure, drive the quality side of things, that can put in the approaches, that can understand how to use the tools. I mean, there's hundreds of variations of tools driven down from context-driven automation through to business process automation through to various COTS products, parasitic tools. How you use those, how you build the frameworks, how you understand what they're telling you, and how you then represent that back to a business stakeholder, an IT stakeholder community, is always going to need a level of understanding and intelligence that puts around it. So I think they're massively interesting. They're providing lots of support and drive for what we want to do and making it really interesting. I think they'll allow us to focus on the more interesting stuff. If we can get away from writing 2,000 manual test scripts to test a payments platform, that would be a lovely thing if we can automate that. Like, nobody really wants to do that. People want to do the understanding, the complexity, driving the quality and identifying where things are broken. At the end of the day, a tester gets a bit of a kick out of finding a bug. It's never going to stop.
And then, Jaren, I know you've asked a question here. I just want you to clarify the question a little bit, because you'd asked a question about working with an automation testing platform and wanting to have access to their code, and they said they wouldn't. I just wanted to understand why you wanted to do that, and then we could probably give a better answer on that chat thread question there. One thing that I was interested about, Neil, is, so we've all globally gone into this lockdown situation in various states in different countries. How does a company like yourself, who are used to being on site with clients, being there to make the change, how have you and your team found and evolved your working to still be useful for the companies that you work with?
So there's two answers to that. The direct answer is really easily, because that's how we've always worked. So the team that we have is very much built on the quality of the delivery that they produce and the relationships they build with their clients and the confidence that comes out. So working remotely, we've done that for a while. We work in an agile way. We've got teams sat in Belfast, we've got teams sat in London, Leeds, Reading, and they work in a way that meets the client's needs. So if they need to be on site because they want some face time and some presence, they're on site. If they work remotely, they work remotely. What we've found is a slightly more challenging place is that, again, some part of the reason the team is so good is they bounce off of each other. They integrate with both our own teams within the wider Deloitte and within the testing function, and then with clients. That's been a bit more difficult, but we found a number of ways through that. I mean, there are a number of coffees with that we have over Zoom. We have different interactions, different events. We know that instead of my office always being open, my Zoom is always available, kind of thing, and people interact. We've got WhatsApp groups. We found a number of different ways to kind of keep the spirit, the camaraderie, the challenge and the innovation flowing. It's just been in a different way. So with clients, we've not actually seen that much of a challenge. We've got the confidence, they know what we can do. As a team, we've worked through that, I think, and we've discussed this as a team a number of times now. I actually think the remote working and working in a different way will become the new normal, and actually we'll end up going into client site or into our own offices maybe once or twice a week, and it will be as much as anything to meet with people, grab a coffee, have a chat, donuts on a Friday, whatever it may be, and that kind of spirit and that teamwork we still need to maintain, and you do lose a little bit of that over Zoom.
Yeah. I think we were quite fortunate that our company, because we work with so many people remotely anyway, we were already able to transition to it quite quickly. And I think we're thinking a similar thing, which is we should have people come in when they need to for what they need to do, right? But it's interesting how the rest of the world is going to adjust in their working style to be everyone being used to working remote. That's the thing that I find most interesting. So just before we wrap up, I do have Jaren's question here, and he was saying that he's having a challenge with a supplier and he needs to have a deeper understanding of their code base due to the regulations that they sit in. and he wanted to know if you had any advice for increasing the transparency with suppliers, or if you've ever had that situation, say when you're working with bags and you wanted to understand a bit more about what this tool was actually doing underneath the hoods.
So it's really difficult for me to answer that because welcome to the world of Deloitte. If anything in that question is related to one of our audit clients, I'd be breaking all kinds of regulations. So I have to answer it really carefully. So apologies for the politically consultative answer. My view would be it depends on what you're trying to understand and how you're trying to do it. Typically, if code's written on a client site, the IP should belong to them depending on what the commercial construct looks like anyway. But if they understand what you're trying to drive at and whether it's about being able to understand the coverage that you're achieving, I think you said it's a low-code solution. So if it's a Mendix type platform and you're trying to look at the automation that sits around that and the testing coverage, they should be able to provide you visibility or give you different ways of meeting the different regulatory aspects that you need to meet. They should be used to those kind of requirements. And again, it goes back to I don't think the way that quality engineering and testing is moving, it's less about the ability to execute. It's more about the ability to articulate what execution and what coverage you're achieving. So tell them what you need to see, tell them how you need to see it, and see how they can provide that level of detail and that confidence in what they've done.
One thing to add to that we have seen is sometimes you can do a third-party independent verification. So you can ask a third-party company to look at and analyze the thing you're trying to analyze, and they're more willing to do that because they feel there's less of a risk than giving it to yourself. And that's what we have sometimes seen as well. So I am going to wrap up because there doesn't seem to be any more questions. And I just wanted to say, firstly, thank you very much, Neil, for jumping on this call and having a chat with us. If people want to continue the discussion, you can use hashtag Cost of Quality 2020 on Twitter, on LinkedIn, and we'll be continuing and monitoring those channels. We would love to get some feedback. What did you like about this session that we did? Leave any comments in the chat and we'll be able to take those on board as we do our retros every single webinar. Other than that, I just want to thank everybody for spending the time, 15 minutes with us. And I hope that you have an awesome week ahead, and goodbye to everybody.